Oh my God, Rachel King's there. How exciting. Megan Cook, all the fellows. Okay, well, then let's get started. Okay, welcome everyone. Okay, first things first, very important. During the Q&A, we've herded all of you into these seats here for a very specific reason, which is if you want to ask a question and you want to make sure the people who are on Zoom can hear your question as well, you need to press the little button in front of the glowing red orb. So, number one. Number two, super important, maybe just as important. We have copies of Marissa's beautiful book that we're going to be discussing today. We're going to raffle them off. So, to take part in the raffle, Matt has some little cards that he's going to pass around. Just write your name on the card. We'll throw it into a little bag. We'll move our hand around the bag to guarantee that everyone has a good chance. And then we'll pull out five names at the end of the event, and you get to take home a copy of this book following our conversation, which will only whet your appetite for more and more. So, welcome to this book party, one of a series of events celebrating new books in critical bibliography, and which is sponsored by Rare Book School's Andrew W. Mellon Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography. I'm Andrew Bricker. I'm a senior fellow in the Society of Fellows and an associate professor of English literature at Ghent University. Today, we're going to be talking about Marissa's lovely book, Imagining Time in the English Chronicle. Sorry, I've already ruined it. Imagining Time in the English Chronicle play, Historical Futures, 1590 to 1660, published by Oxford University Press in 2023. Marissa is Associate Professor of Renaissance Literature at the Pennsylvania State University, Abington College. She's also editor with Emma DePledge and John S. Garrison of Making Milton, Print, Authorship, Afterlives, published by Oxford University Press in 2020, and editor with John S. Garrison of Renaissance Futures, a special volume of explorations in Renaissance culture from 2019. She runs the public history website Cooking in the Archives and has published articles on early modern literature, book history, and food studies in edited volumes and in modern philology, Milton Studies, the Papers of the Bibliographical Society of America, Studies in Philology, the Early Modern Studies Journal, and Post-Medieval. In Imagining Time, Marissa offers a compelling account of how playwrights in chronicle plays and poet journalists in their play pamphlets thought about the future by performing the past. This all takes place between the late 16th century and mid-17th century, a period when questions of monarchical succession were particularly fraught. Both the Elizabethan succession crisis and the English Revolution offered fractures in monarchical succession and thus time. And it was these chronicle plays that, to quote Marissa, reveal pressing anxieties about the institution of hereditary monarchy, the line of succession, and the tenuous relationships among competing claimants to the throne, end quote. Just as later play pamphlets produced during the mid-17th century, quote, projected possible futures beyond the present moment, documenting unfolding political crises in real time, while also envisioning possible futures. These dramatic narratives, Marissa contends, thus offered a way to speculate about this future through the both immediate and distant past. As she puts it in her introduction, these playwrights, quote, simultaneously documented what was and imagined what might be. So please join me in welcoming Marissa. Okay, with big research, big long-term research projects, I'm always interested to know where did the project start, right? So what for you is the origin of the project? How did you go from reading one or two, I don't know, plain text or whatever, to then conceptualizing a dissertation, writing a book, revising a book, publishing a book, and arriving here today in the afternoon at Penn State.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Andrew, for summarizing my book and for asking me this question. So I became very, very interested in 17th century literature as an undergraduate student from classes in classes I was taking at Barnard College, where I did my bachelor's, and when I studied abroad at King's College in London, where the 17th century got taught a bit differently than it did in the American Academy. And I wanted to go to grad school to study 17th century poetry and plays. And I took a class with Zachary Lesser in the fall of my second year of graduate school. And I read a play pamphlet called The Tragedy of King Charles I Basely Butchered, the famous tragedy of King Charles I Basely Butchered. And I was completely and totally perplexed by what this printed object was that I had just read. And I looked at it in the rear book room, and I wanted to understand it. I really wanted to understand it. I couldn't figure out what was going on. And I had gone to this talk at Rutgers, and I was sitting on New Jersey Transit on my way home, and I was like, "Oh, I think I got it. I know what's going on with this play. It's something about memory and commonplacing and the propulsion of memory into the future. That's how this play is doing historical work." So I had a legal pad with me because I had just been at a lecture, and I started writing what became a seminar. At the end of that graduate seminar, we had a class conference. So it was my little conference paper as the end of that seminar. And that became the seed of my dissertation. And that became the part of the dissertation I carried into this book. And there's some sentences in chapter 5 of this book that are connected to sentences I wrote sitting on a New Jersey Transit train and then a SEPTA train, because I had to connect in Trenton on my way back from that lecture. So that's where that thinking started.
The big surprise here is all great ideas come from New Jersey public transit. So amazing. Yeah, good for you, New Jersey. Okay. So let's maybe talk a bit about the materials that are involved, because I know we've talked about this between each other, that you have a little bit of an odd corpus, right, for this project. Not just an odd timeline, this sort of long 17th century you're talking about, but you're combining two different types of objects, right? One, on the one hand, chronicle plays, and on the other hand, play pamphlet. And so I was wondering if maybe you could tell all of us, what are these things? But then also draw out a little bit, what's the connection between the two of them as they relate to the argument you're trying to pursue about historical features.
Okay, so the people in the room who are students in some of my current classes, you'll hear me talk about history plays a lot and about Shakespeare's history plays. So Shakespeare's history plays are grounded in a form of history that was important in the 16th century called Chronicle history. These are in reference to Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles, which is really a collaboratively authored thing by not just Raphael Holinshed, but this form of big books of historical accounts of the English past. So a play that I talk about in the first chapter of my book, I talk about 1 Henry IV, the first part of the Shakespeare's Henry IV plays. That play takes some material from Holinshed and some other historical sources, and then it also runs wild with those sources and does things that are not at all in those sources at all. And Shakespeare and Thomas Heywood and Christopher Marlowe and Samuel Rowley were all writing at the turn of the hinge between the 16th and 17th century, plays that retold stories of the English national past based on these longer form historical documents. And there are also a bunch of other plays that playwrights like Shakespeare and his contemporaries were writing that they called histories that were about other places. They might be about Roman history, or they might be set in another nation altogether. So I took the term chronicle play from E.M.W. Tillyard, who wrote a very famous book about Shakespeare's historical imagination, to really focus on the fact that this is about English history specifically. And that's one of the things I'm marking by using the term chronicle play instead of using the term history play. So these are what we would now break into 5-act plays that run somewhere between 3 and 4 hours on the stage, and were initially performed and then later printed. And so the first 3 chapters of my book deal with that kind of material. The final 2 chapters of my book deal with the era when the theaters were closed during the English Civil Wars. At first, they were closed temporarily with a temporary order, and then they were closed permanently. And this was because theaters were thought to be spaces of public foment, potential insurrection. They were maybe dangerous places to have open during a time of such civil strife. They also were closed in times of plague. So temporary closures of the theater for public health crises or political crises were fairly normal. And these plays really think about themselves as plays. They use all of the norms of printed drama. They have act and scene breaks, entrances and exits, speech prefixes, dramatis personae at the front, but they're very short. And they weren't performed that we know of. They could have been performed, but they weren't performed that we know of. They have everything you need to possibly be performed, but we don't know that they were. So they textually are related to the Chronicle plays that came before them. And ultimately, all of these plays feature people who actually lived at some point in history and held positions of political power, saying things that they may or may not have ever actually said. And that's something that, to me, the way that they're printed and the way that they do this work of having living political figures or once living political figures say and do things, that really connects them for me.
Great. So on the, no, that's a great answer. And sort of, it makes me think, the issue of, having once living people on the stage, right? Having historical figures. We all know that history is boring, right? So why was this so incredibly interesting to Elizabethan and early Stuart audiences? Like, why did they want to go see people on stage? And I was thinking about this as well when I was flying over here, trapped inside an airplane for 7 hours. So I watched Oppenheimer, because otherwise who could possibly watch a 3-hour movie on a historical event? And I thought the positive version of this is, the broadest outlines of a historical event. I think this is how you frame it in your book a little bit. What's interesting is watching that inevitable outcome play out to some extent. Whereas I also thought of the negative version of this, thinking about a show like Netflix's Drive to Survive, which is, apparently F1 fans do not like the show because they already know so much about F1. And I wonder if you can also view, to some extent, the negative version of the history play or the Chronicle play is that it's taking this material that some people might know very well and then foisting onto it a whole bunch of anachronisms, which you also flag up in your book.
Yeah, I think there's a pleasure to seeing commonly known stories told again. And so when writers like Thomas Haywood and Thomas Nash write about what's good about history plays, what's good about Chronicle plays, they talk about the didactic potential for seeing figures from the past to refight famous battles, re-give famous speeches, re-sign famous treaties between governments, make royal or matrimonial matches that are going to lead to thriving moments in the nation's history. So there's this kind of pleasure and maybe this like good schooling. Despite the fact that sometimes I talk to colleagues who find teaching history plays, students react with boredom, or that they're complicated or they're not enjoyable. But we do know for Shakespeare's audiences in particular that his history plays were the most popular works in print. They went through the most editions. So more editions than Hamlet, more editions than A Midsummer Night's Dream, more editions than the kind of go-to big best hits of Shakespeare that we would think. So Shakespeare's Richard III, Richard II, the two Henry IV plays, and Henry V are by far his best sellers in print. And we think there's some debate about this, but we think every time there was a new printed edition, there was probably also a revival in performance on the stage. So, and so every couple of years during Shakespeare's active life and practice in the theater, there would be a kind of new play. And often so there might be, in the case of Shakespeare and Fletcher's Henry VIII, at the end of Shakespeare's career, there's this kind of dialogue with Samuel Rowley's "When You See Me, You Know Me" that I talk about in chapter 2 of the book, and they're playing off one another. So there's this vogue for maybe having Henry VIII plays, and they're playing back and forth with one another. Thomas Heywood's history plays are super popular too. So we know that the English audience at this particular moment from the 1580s through the 1640s, early 1640s, or the 1640s, wanted to go and see these stories again and again and again. Yeah.
Do you have a sense why though? Like, what is like the draw of it? I mean, I can infer something, I think, from your book itself, but
Yeah.
it's not something I think we address so much.
No, I don't. Yeah. You know, I think we really valorize in 21st century, particularly American culture, originality, a new story, something completely new. But there's also the other side of that, which is the like comfort of the familiar, which is why maybe there's now a film of a Mean Girls musical that was a Mean Girls film, right? So and like deciding that High Fidelity, the like book to film could be a TV show remade. We keep remaking movies or turning something into a musical and then turning it back into a movie in our culture. I think it had that maybe kind of comfort, like known story that we can retell and everyone's going to be interested in it. Kind of cachet. So it's not necessarily innovative in telling a new story. What I'm interested in my analysis of these, like maybe common or almost like stories that become hackneyed because they're told so much, about the ways that they can be adapted to touch on issues in the moment that they're being performed and restaged, how they resonate differently in the Elizabethan succession crisis, and then might resonate differently under King James, and then might be quite different if they're played in front of Charles the First. There's a scene in 1 Henry IV where Prince Hal and Falstaff are playing the roles of the king and the prince, and they're changing off. And when Hal says, "Oh no, I'll play my father," Falstaff says, "You're deposing me." And that's when that's reprinted during the English Civil War is when they've just executed a king, and when the king is in prison earlier. That, "Oh, you just deposed me," like means something completely different in that context. Yeah, they can be adaptable and resonate in different ways, maybe because they're so familiar.
Yeah, that's interesting. So again, we're talking a little bit about performance as it's tied especially to the earlier material, the Chronicle plays and the historical plays that you deal with in your early chapters. And you've talked a little bit about play pamphlets, right? On paper, they look like plays, right? They have lots of play-like qualities, but I think we can sort of largely presume they were non-performative despite looking like plays. Like you could perform them, but they sort of didn't end up even in, closet drama style performances, I think we can see. I was wondering then, to what extent performance is important to this project in terms of how it connects the two halves of the material you're looking at. And what would happen to your argument if you say went outside of these dramatic genres, right? Like, why not look at something like, say, non-dramatic poetry or lyric poetry or something like that? What happens to this conceptualization of the past to start projecting into the future with other kinds of genres?
Well, this actually takes me back to my dissertation in an interesting way, which was called Historical Futures in 17th Century Literature. And in that project, I had a chapter on the history play. That is what grew into this book. And I had a chapter on romance and a chapter on epic. And I was going to write a chapter on lyric poetry, but I didn't end up writing that because I needed to finish my dissertation at a certain point. And the tactics For imagining the future in accounts of the past are very much there in those other genres. They just have different moves. And part of why the moves are different is because the figures might be an allegorical figure in a romance, or a speaker in a lyric poem, and they're not a character who's walking on stage and saying, I am John Lilburn, or I am Charles the First, or I am Oliver Cromwell, or I am Henry V, right? So because they don't have that inherently dialogic structure of drama, they do something different. But I have seen this, I have traced and published on this dynamic of how these texts that say they're doing something about the national past are really making a lot of claims for what a national future should be, should not be, could be, ever should be, in all sorts of ways.
Right. Well, so I also had other questions, I think, of what actually then is in the book. And I think one of the things that you do in the book really well is give us terminology to understand some of these complicated temporal moves between the past being performed in the present to somehow talk about the future. And I think two terms jumped out to me, and they appear throughout the book. One of them is historical futures, which I think is very paradoxical and not so intuitive. So I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about the idea of historical futures and what that does in imagining time. And the other one is a term that shows up throughout that you build on from the first chapter on, which is almanac time. So what is almanac time? Because that's another genre in some ways that you're using, but using to some level as a kind of figuration for temporality itself. So maybe you can tell us a bit more about those two terms.
Absolutely. I'm happy to define and think through those two terms. So the historical future is specifically when a writer is writing a narrative of the past, and they slip over from the past into the present and into the future without marking that they're shifting their time scale from what was and is known to what might be and is unknown. And this slippage happens a lot, and I believe it is almost always intentional and political when it happens. It's either about trying to connect a specific desired or undesired future to a narrative of past events that are verifiable and known. I think it happens slightly differently in the accounts of histories that are completely over by the time of publication. So it happens a little bit differently in the case of Henry IV and Prince Hal than it does in the case of Cromwell and Charles I in the later materials. So I see those futures becoming more like calls to forms of direct political action in the material from the English Civil War than in the material from earlier in the book and in the time frame. And that relates, that idea of the historical futures is in contrast in some ways to almanac time, another major term. So almanacs were the most common printed material in early modern Britain. You could buy one and use one for the year, really depending on your literacy. You could still buy and use one if you had numeracy and could read the calendar pages. Better if you had full literacy, people would read them to one another. There were single sheet versions of them that were pasted in public places. They were a way to orient yourself in, okay, what day is it today? Is it a day that I need to know about for a religious reason, for a holiday reason, for an astrological and astronomical reason? So they were very popular and they were widely disseminated. And a standard feature of almanacs is that they have a list of the regnal succession. They have a list of who the rulers of the realm were and are. And they also have tables of years since, like important events, like years since the Battle of Agincourt, the blazing star in the sky, the creation of the Bible in English, right? Years since kind of framing. So I argue that early modern ways of imagining time were often about kind of years since or in relation to the succession of monarchs and time since particular historical events. And you see in markings in almanacs, almanac users using that formation of years since to talk about how many years have passed since someone in their family died, or like kind of aligning their dates with these dates of national history. So I use almanac time for this worldview where people are thinking in relation to these kinds of calendars that allow for retrospection and future projection. And to me, that's not necessarily, it's related to, but distinct from the way we might approach thinking with time today, where we might be reckoning time in a day-to-day way or thinking about relation to past, present, and future along different axes, depending on, in some ways, the technologies that we're using to navigate time.
Okay, I'll ask maybe one more question, and then we'll turn it over to the group and to all the wonderful people who've joined online. Okay, so to some extent, all of the works you're studying in this book are tied to issues of monarchical succession. Okay. And I was wondering what you would do with some very canonical works, like Shakespeare, for instance, like King Lear, which maybe doesn't have the historical dimension, or even a kind of parallel historical dimension like Macbeth, right? Works that are also preoccupied with questions of succession, right? And so, I mean, this is less asking you to make these fit inside of your argument, but I'm wondering what something like your book, Imagining Time, does to illuminate these other kinds of literatures that have some parallels, but don't quite belong to the kind of generic qualities or kinds of timelines that you're particularly interested in.
I think a lot about in Macbeth, when Lady Macbeth wants to get rid of the ignorant present because she feels the future in the instant, right? This kind of moment where usurpation has really challenged succession. And that's a play I've been mulling over, trying to figure out how to write about using the frameworks I've been working on, particularly because James I in the audience was seeing that play and seeing Banquo and Fleance as theirs, right? So he was connecting that as a spectator to his own line of succession. And so I think that there's a way where a logic of almanac time illuminates what ends up being the kind of rightful pattern of succession coming out of Macbeth, but maybe doesn't fully account for like the temporality of the Macbeths themselves. They're kind of like total path towards destruction as in the tragic downfall of the play. Yeah, so I think that there's ways that the logic of what I'm working through could hopefully either inspire me or other people to take on these kind of metaphorical temporal moves or these kind of bigger framing theoretical moves that I'm working through, because what are the witches' many prophecies in that play if not staging prolepsis or staging like scenes of active prophecy? And that's a key term that I think about a lot in my third chapter.
Wonderful. Okay. So I've already taken up lots of time asking my questions for Marissa, and you so rarely get to ask the author of a book questions that you haven't. So I would now like to turn over to the group. So for the people who are physically present, just a reminder, if you want to ask a question, make sure to press the little button in front of you so everyone online can hear. So if anyone wants to start, we can also hop over to online, I think. Oh, you have a question? Please go ahead.
What would you say is like the contemporary equivalent of like watching a history play at the time of Shakespeare? Would it be watching something like The Crown, or like is there anything else that's similar?
I think watching The Crown absolutely could be. Well, I think the camera is centered on you.
You move up it.
And
now-
okay, wait, maybe let's both come to the podium.
We're gonna walk over
We're
here.
just gonna walk over here instead of moving the camera.
Okay, here we are.
Okay. Thank you for that question, Kane. I think watching a history play, something like a Chronicle play today about British history, could be something like The Crown. A play that I got to write about in the coda to this book is a play by Mike Bartlett called King Charles III that was written and staged in 2014. And as I was finishing the book, Queen Elizabeth II died and King Charles III got crowned as king. So suddenly something that I had been writing about as a future history play was a future history play that had now become completely out of date and obsolete as a counterfactual, because it did not happen. The things that Mike Bartlett imagined happening when Charles took the throne did not happen. It was a kind of outdated view, a 2014 view of what happened in 2022 and 2023. So yeah, I think some of the other materials that I deal with later in the book about the English Civil War are much more satirical, and some of the sketches that they have about topical politics or politics happening in the day-to-day look much more like an SNL sketch, where you have people dressed up as current and impersonating current political figures, than they do like a rarefied history play. Yes, the back.
When we're using this term historical future, are these authors presenting this as speculative future, or is there another way that they're presenting it?
Sometimes they're not marking it at all as different from their account of the past that they've been giving. And sometimes they do mark it as this is something that might happen in the nation if we continue along this particular path. And it really varies whether they mark it or not. Because I think marking it has certain impacts and implications, and not marking it, I think also you could almost miss it and just like assume that it's real.
I wonder, how is it determined, right? Like if you as a reader, or which I think a lot of this is material, right? You as a reader, or you as somebody watching this play being performed, I'm wondering, like, what kind of markers are you looking for? What are the giveaways? Is it sort of tense usage? Is it modal verb? Like, at what point do you realize, oh, we've just shifted from the present tense of the speaking person in the past to a kind of super future tense beyond the present of the recipient into the future of absolutely.
Yeah, sometimes it's the modal verb. Sometimes it's shall, will. Sometimes it's a kind of set piece scene where it's like, okay, everyone, we're going to do some prophecy now. So there's this moment at the end of Shakespeare and Fletcher's Henry VIII where there's a kind of parade, a formal procession through the city, and there's a lot of interesting processions in that play. And this is going to be the christening of the baby Elizabeth. So the Archbishop of Canterbury, Archbishop Cranmer, stands over the baby and says, she will be bring in a golden age where every man will eat from the fruit of his land and drink from the wine of his own vines, and everyone will live in splendor. And then after her, it's going to continue to be great because he will lead the nation. And this is James the First, this kind of unnamed named he, and Elizabeth is dead at this point, and James is on the throne, and it's just kind of there's a lot of shall and will and these markers saying this is the future that is going to happen and that we want to happen. And has happened in this case. And with James, there's a kind of imagining into that present moment, like it will still happen and it will still be good.
I was wondering about the sort of affective dimensions of these plays. I haven't read any of the Chronicles. Not familiar. And so, I'm thinking kind of like Andrew was talking about other sort of comparative situations, like with Hamlet, I'm thinking of, where, that sort of time being out of jointedness produces like an uncanny sort of effect, right? In readers and audiences. Is there an uncanniness in the sort of historical future presentation, or is it a sort of a different kind of affect or sort of response that is produced in this kind of arrangement?
There isn't as much uncanniness in that sense of a haunting or something that's returned and shouldn't be there. The thing that comes closest is in my chapter where I write about Richard III and Perkin Warbeck. There's this sense that there's these sutures that shouldn't happen. So I argue that Richard III gets treated, even though he was a king, gets treated as this aberration, as this kind of horrible, terrible cul-de-sac in what was supposed to be this nice, orderly succession, that even though he was king, he gets treated like a pretender to the throne. He gets, because of his usurpation, he gets illegitimized. And so, and that's where you have some of that kind of negative affect that's coming up. And in Ford's play, Perkin Warbeck, which I mean, maybe one day I'll see it on the stage and it'll be really lively. It's not much of a page turner, but it has really interesting stuff for what I wanted to do. I can't recommend to go read that one right now, but it has this character Perkin, who's supposed to be one of the innocents slaughtered in the Tower, who's like, no, I'm the son of Edward IV, I'm king, right? And it's his kind of claim to the throne, and he actually behaves more kingly than many other people. So it's like, well, really, and that kind of indeterminacy about what who really is legitimate is part of what's going on there. So that's where you get those kind of icky affects, so just kind of like negative feelings. And it's and in both these cases, it's being told by the victors, right? After those figures are no longer, or have been dismissed as Richard III as a violent usurper in the narratives that we get about him. Perkin Warbeck as a pretender, not legitimate claimant. Yeah. Are there other questions in the room or on Zoom? Nice.
First, congratulations again on getting your work published. It's amazing to hear about your work. My question is about how you came to realize that one of your dissertation chapter, I believe, could become a book. Like at what point you realize that, oh, like there is a book hiding in this chapter? Did you, like how came to that? How did you arrive?
I'm gonna thought this is a historical futures kind of question, right? Sort of how did you in the past envision this book coming into being in the future?
Yeah. No, this is a great question. This is not how anyone recommends you turn your dissertation into a book. This is not recommended at all. It takes a lot longer. It requires massive amounts of additional archival research that it is hard to find the time for, and often difficult to support with funding after the PhD stage. I'm very grateful. I had fellowships from the Folger Shakespeare Library and the William Andrews Clark Memorial Library, and support from Penn State and Penn State Abington, and support from the Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography at Rare Book School that allowed me to get back to archives to look at new stuff. So to go back to the beginning, I was finishing my dissertation, and I kept realizing this one chapter, my first chapter, kept getting longer than all my other chapters, and I liked it the most, and it hung together the best. And I walked into, I had the public portion of my dissertation defense, and then the private portion. The private portion is a meeting just with your committee. And I said, do you think chapter 1's actually the book and not the whole thing? And my mentors were like, yeah, that actually has coherence as a book in a way. This whole project, you'd really need to really rethink a lot of different things to make these genres speak to one another. They're like, this is this kind of take one and scrap the rest, publish the rest as article does not, that's not an easy road to publishing a book. It's a lot easier if your dissertation is the first full draft or first partial draft of your book. But they're like, but that's a better book. Write the book you want to write the book that you think is the better book. We see what you see here. It's pretty obvious that this one chapter is trying to take over this whole project. So the what were sections in that chapter became chapters, became the kind of 4 chapters. And the first chapter on almanac time is the one that I completely wrote from new research. But the whole of the book is has been enhanced by my time in libraries, my time working in collaboration with other people, my time like really spending more time with the project, which is why I finished my dissertation in 2014 and the book came out in 2023. That's one reason it took that there was that long period there after I'd already done a lot of work on my dissertation.
So I agree. You took the wrong approach, right? Like you've created so much more work for yourself, right? But then you also took the right approach, which you ended up with an extremely focused, well-argued, coherent kind of project. And so again, if we can sort of go back in time to that moment where you submit your dissertation and kind of come to the realization in consultation with the committee that the book is hiding inside one of the chapters. Was that a moment of, excitement and clarity, or was it sort of more of a dawning on you, like, I still have like a huge amount of road to hoe at this point?
It was helpful in terms of being able to actually see the project clearly for the first time. Because that moment of clarity was like, okay, I know what I need to do. And I know I have so much more to say about some of these texts and pairings of texts and frames than I'm able to say in this little 10-page section. So, okay, it's going to be this work of expansion that I'll be doing for a while. But I felt like real clarity in having a project that I could finally really understand the whole thing, really see the full shape. But another thing that's kind of funny about that is that in the initial plan for what this book was going to be, in fact, what I wrote to the clerk saying I was going to go there and do on fellowship is that there was going to be another chapter on the 1660s through 1680s materials, where I was going to look at how Restoration history plays built on what happened during the English Civil War, as well as what happened in the public theaters earlier. But then it became a moment that there just wasn't enough time to write that. I did look at the materials I said I would look at when I went to the clerk. I took a lot of notes. I have ideas. I have a couple ideas for like some really good articles on that, but I couldn't finish it in the time that I had, so I had to stop. But like the truest version of the project would have gone like to 1680 and had another like hefty chapter.
Andrew's part is turning over.
I know.
Maybe check in online as well to see if people are maybe adding anything to either the chat or if you want to raise your hand.
Look at this.
Rachel came in and Lila would like from her phone would like to be entered in the wrap up. I'm sorry, in person. We're rewarding the people who showed up. Please do all the way up top.
Okay, so we have Megan McNamee and then Megan Cook.
So many Megans. Okay.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Been a while. So excited about this book. Can't wait to read it. And we'll definitely need to talk almanacs. And actually, that's where my question is coming from. I actually have 2 questions. You can address one and not the other, or both, if you think you have time. One is when the shift is into prophecy or the future, what kind of temporal distances are you talking about? Like how far? And are they generational? Is it seasonal? That's the kind of thing that I'm interested in, because I'm looking at almanacs that are parsing time in a lot of different ways. And I'm quite interested in the sort of the duration, how they're marking it out. The other question is about how period specific do you think the sense of time that you're looking at is? how much of it is of the moment?
I think I'll answer your first question, or your second question first, Megan. So I think there's something about the like later 16th century through the later 17th century where we're working in a landscape of sundials, of stand glasses that will tell an hour. We're just starting to get mechanisms to make smaller clocks work reliably. That's in 1647. There's a big innovation in like clock mechanisms. So you can actually have a household clock that tells time more accurately. We're in an era of public clocks that have a minute hand and an hour hand, but we don't have a second hand going, where the seasonal time of the almanac, the summer, fall, winter, spring, the labors of the month are so important. So I think that we're maybe in an overlap here between like time rotations of seasonal time that are connected to a kind of great chain of being model, which we could connect to medieval and early modern, is moving into like new mechanizations of time, particularly with like the changes in clock technology. I think in the period, time is really constructed relationally in terms of like when people need to be with each other. And it's really very constructed very socially and adaptively and flexibly. So we like you would set a meeting in London by the bells of a specific church, because even though they're all technically telling the same time, they're all going to ring slightly differently because they're all mechanized slightly differently or tended slightly differently. So I think that maybe connects, that answers your first question or second question and starts to connect to the first one. With the almanacs, sometimes it's years, sometimes it's seasons. Sometimes the amount of time people are thinking about is in weeks, and sometimes it's about future generations. So in some of the English Civil War materials, they're saying future generations will remember us in this way. And sometimes they're saying, there's one case where there's a notice appended to a pamphlet, The British Bellman, as well as the play pamphlet, Crafty Cromwell, that says, please distribute these throughout town so that we can retake London for the royalists while the parliamentary army is off doing something else. So they're like, okay, in the next couple of days, we would like to actually have a militarized political action that is reclaiming a city from one faction to another, right? So the scales are really all over the place. And I'd love to talk more about the work you're doing on almanacs and how we can talk about time scale.
Thanks so much. Again, congratulations.
Okay. Would you like to read Megan's question?
Yeah, sure. From one Megan to another. Okay, so Megan Cook writes, I'm going to type my question, which is, how does the argument in this book relate to your other research interests in both book history and food history? What connections, if any, do you see? I'm particularly curious about the relationship between culinary time, historical time, and dramatic time.
Oh, I love this question. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for these great questions. So I'm really interested in a usable past and the way that we can connect with written records across time. So for me, like my interest in recreating historical recipes is in part seeing if those instructions for how to make something actually will still work. I became really interested in these 17th century political works because I was interested in a time where literature and poetry were part of the language of state, or part of the language of how real things happened in the political world. So to me, the kind of layers of material history, my book history work, and how that informs how I understand these documents is tied up both in these kinds of temporalities that I'm working with, like in the historical period, but also in tracing those bigger gaps between then and now, between the 16th and 17th centuries and kind of where we're at today. Mm-hmm. Any other questions from the room or from Zoom?
General question. Tappity
Tappity button.
Tappity.
Thank you. I'm wondering how much of your book is sort of indebted to the archive. Like, how much of this material did you sort of, need to be in certain places, like, tax as unpublished material, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so it's interesting where the archive begins and ends, and what kind of archive it is. So I started out reading that famous tragedy of King Charles I, basely butchered, on a printout from early English books online, which are photographs of books turned into microfilms, turned into a ProQuest database that also had a recent, like, gigantic overhaul and redesign for its searchability and things. So I still have that copy, and it's covered completely with my notes in various layers of different colored pen from different, and pencil from different times and different passes through. But I've also looked at so many copies of that play pamphlet in its varying editions and varying, there's a kind of Cromwell's Conspiracy has like a secret hidden second issue within the edition. So I've looked at tons and tons of copies and seen how these works were gathered together. So something like the famous tragedy of Charles I, I'm not sure if it's actually this one or some of the other play pamphlets I read. Edmund Malone, the famous Shakespeare editor, bound them in a book that he called Rare Plays, like with some other really interesting works from the 17th century stage. So there are a lot of texts that most of the texts that I deal with in the book are accessible via early English books online, but looking at them in that black and white, high contrast, sometimes original print blurred, like superimposed over the materials, because the printing on some of this stuff is just really gnarly, particularly the illegal printing of stuff. I've also looked at so much of it in archives, and in some ways the responses to these works in the way that they were bound together in different ways, or the way that they have been annotated has led me to some of my insights. So for especially those of you who are in the class that have read Richard III, there's a prophecy about the letter G in that play. On that page, in a copy of a later edition of Richard III in the special collections at University of Pennsylvania, where I did my doctoral work, there are G's written all over that page. And you want it to be someone thinking about the prophecy of G, thinking about this prophecy that centers on this letter. But it could also just be someone practicing their letters in a book, which is so common, right? So it's that kind of piece of archival evidence. Like, I want to be able to overread it, and I can't in good conscience. As a good book historian, I can't say that. But but I think I could have done. There is a noise, and I'm not sure where it's coming from. Playing music. Nope, we are not playing music.
Sorry, I had a big lunch.
Okay, I think it's stopped. Yeah, I wouldn't have written this book if I hadn't spent time looking at rare books, and not so much manuscript materials, but handwritten materials within printed books have been really important for the work that I've done.
Okay, I'm going to take the prerogative as the person who got to interview you to ask maybe the final question before we do the raffle. And while you answer the question, I will all of the. Yes, that's exactly what I was thinking. So I don't know what this noise is. Maybe I'll just. Okay, so the question I wanted to ask you is built a little bit on Megan Cook's question, right?
Yeah.
So are you done?
Is anyone hitting their speaking button?
Yeah, there may be a sweater on top of the button or something.
Okay, thank you.
What, okay, so are you done to some extent with the topics that are in Imagining Time, or do you see kind of arguments that you've engaged with there playing out in some of this future research you're going to do? Or alternatively, or another way to put it, what is it you're hoping people are going to get from this book? What are going to like read Imagining Time? Where do literary scholars go from there, or history scholars, or scholars of drama, or people interested in the construction of time during the early modern period? Like, where do they take the research you've done, or where do you hope they'll take that research?
Oh, this is such a fun question. Okay, so I think for scholars of early modern literature, I want them to, one, see that the stuff happening during the English Civil Wars is really connected. I this is just a baffling noise. Okay, let's just move the camera. Nope, we're the other way.
That's me.
Okay, so scholars of English literature, I really want them to connect the plays from the public stage of Shakespeare and his contemporaries to stuff during the English Civil Wars, because there's a hard and fast boundary there that is completely artificial in terms of like how people were living and people were writing and people's actual lifespans and stuff. So that's an artificial disciplinary boundary. And I worked my whole career and will continue to work to challenge that boundary. I want people, when they think about history and when they think about time, to not necessarily trust that they know what that is. So I hope that they come to this book and think about the ways that I map out different ways that people were positioning themselves in time, both historians and literary scholars. I want them to have their ideas about what time is and how people imagined it in literature unsettled a bit. I think that would be pretty productive. And that's work that I want to continue doing in my future projects. So one of them is about seasons and recipes in time, seasonal tastes, literary and recipe cultures, 1550 to 1750, where I'm finally getting to write like the lyric poetry chapter of my dissertation. I never got to write, but I'm thinking in bigger ways about seasonality as a time frame, and seasonality in relation to environment, and how you turn how that comes up in poetry, and how you also turn ingredients into food, usable food to store. Andrew's gotten to hear me give some of that work and present some of that work in progress. And that's, Megan, I'll be still thinking about almanacs in that work. That's going to be a big link for me between these projects. Yeah. So we have a question from Dr. Miller.
Oh yeah, I'll
Here we go. We'll move the mic to you.
I know Marissa and I have talked often about just the excitement of working with original documents and going to various special collections, and the unexpected nature of it, that you never really know what you're going to find. You think you're going to find something, but you find something totally, totally different. And it may actually turn the direction of where you're going by seeing some document you hadn't anticipated. So my question to you, Marissa, is was there a moment in your research where you encountered a kind of like, oh my God, what is this? It was unexpected, maybe even changed the direction you were going.
You have 10 seconds to think about it as I walk the microphone back to you.
I do. So when I was preparing for my comprehensive exams, I noticed these series of quotation marks in this pamphlet called The Fairy Leveler. And this pamphlet called The Fairy Leveler takes an excerpt from Spenser's Fairy Queen and uses it to tell a story about Oliver Cromwell. So it takes Spenser and decides that Spenser is going to be useful for talking about Oliver Cromwell. And it does this by putting all these little question marks next to the quotation from Spenser, and that's to show that it's quoted. And it does this in the style of what I later learned was an animadversion pamphlet, or a pamphlet where you quote and you show what you're quoting with these quotation marks, and then you write your responses back to it. And that I published an article on reading Spenser in 1648. That's about Samuel Shepherd's Fairy Leveler. And I was looking at play pamphlets. I looked at this play pamphlet called The Leveler's Levels, and I saw those quotation marks again. And that was telling me that this pamphlet was not just this, like, it's a satire of the leveler political movement, which said we should redistribute property and reclaim public lands and the more radical forms of the movement. And And in it, this play pamphlet that's saying that the levelers are terrible and we don't want to live in a society like that. It quotes from this work called The Agreement of the People. That's one of the most important leveler pamphlets that expresses like a leveler political theory. And those little anonymous diversion question marks told me that that's what that was. And then I checked and I'm like, oh, it's almost a verbatim quotation. It's using this kind of pamphlet debate move to make this case. And I said, okay, that was not treated heavily in my dissertation. I was like, this needs a really big section in this book. This needs a nice long section in my chapter on play pamphlets because it's doing this intertextual work in really interesting ways. So it was quotation marks line after line after line that cued me in. And seeing it that earlier time, it kind of told me what to look for. And then I realized it was going to be important in this book. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, good. Okay, I think that's a great place to wrap up. So it's a book party. It's not a book interrogation. So we should start by toasting Marissa and thanking her for sharing so many of her thoughts about her book, the project, its long history, and then where she's going after this. So thank you very much, Marissa.
Thank you all.
And there's so much applause on the Zoom. Oh my God, it's deafening. Okay, and now, of course, because it's a party, there's a raffle.
There's a raffle.
Would you like to help raffle off your own book?
Yes, I would.
This is called Let's Get to Paperback. This is a joke that only people understand who published with OUP.
Okay. Miriam. Okay, that's one. Kayla. Alexis. Bailey. Okay, we got 4. All right, one more. I know.
And Jody, I don't know.
And Haley.
Yeah, okay, great.
Okay.
Oh, I feel like I'm on the Price is Right or something like that. Okay, this is great. All right. Well, with that, we'll hand out these books, and I'll thank, again, everyone for coming. I'll thank all of the people on Zoom for joining us, or asking your questions. And again, thank you so much, Marissa.
Thank you. Okay. And everyone who's here, there are snacks.